Welcome to Saturday Morning Classics. We are currently reading The Island by T.M. Wright, and this week we're starting on Chapter 6. So sit back, grab a cup of coffee, and enjoy the story. Chapter 6, January 14th. Muriel Fox put her skis up, took off her coat, set water on for tea, and decided coffee would be better. The cold today had been biting, wounding, a bad day for cross-country skiing, too, with so little snow on the ground. Her small house, filled with knick-knack memorabilia, was very warm, the thermostat set high, but she did not feel it at once. She shivered intermittently with each recollection of the day, as if her memory of recent cold made her cold all over again. She was thin, square-faced, her skin hard, creased, and darkened by decades of exposure to the crisp slap of weather in the Adirondacks. Her brown eyes sparkled with humor, often without apparent reason, though this was only because she found humor in situations that most people considered mundane. More than once in the last few years, since she'd reached her 60s, she had told herself that the human body ages, the blood slows, the heat within diminishes, and that it was time at last to accept all of that and stay indoors on days such as this. But she was a creature of habit, and her habit was to forget the weather and do what made her happy. Cross-country skiing made her happy. She fixed her coffee, took it to the living room, and set it on a dark cherry table near her chair, which stood before the fireplace. She stared at the fireplace as waves of cold passed through her like sickness and made her shiver. At last she decided that she did not need a fire, and she sat in her chair. She knew that she was very lonely. She knew also the pictures she presented to anyone who bothered to look. Aging, feisty, stubborn. "She'll kick 3 or 4 times in the coffin before giving up the ghost," they would say. In spring and summer her spirit would tend her garden. In winter it would ski. In the Adirondacks, beautiful autumn came and went as quickly as a blush. An act of defiance to what she saw as her cringing inner self, a conscious denial of what others would see as real and undeniable, had brought her here 40 years before, alone. She had been born as a kind of ice child, she maintained, because New England in winter had been her place and time of birth. So that was how she would grow, with a love for the bitter cold and mere tolerance of warmth and summer sun. Let the others, the weak, prattle on about the awful approach of winter. Let them babble about spending January and February in Florida. Let them sweat. Let them stick to each other. For her, cheeks and foreheads and noses burned red by the cold wind, and breath that stung and made the insides brittle were what living was all about. It had not always been her way of thinking. As a child, on a visit to her grandfather's farm in Watertown, she'd gotten stuck, exhausted, in a winter storm when she was just yards from safety and warmth. Then sleep had overtaken her. And when she awoke, hours later, in her bedroom where her grandfather had taken her, struggling up out of hypothermia, her body felt as if it were indeed made of ice, that it was cracking here and there, coming apart, giving her pain such as she had never felt before. For years afterward, she went out in winter only when it was necessary, and she saw to it that it was seldom necessary. She waited inside her porch for the school bus and ran out when its doors were opening for her. When others her age went off sledding or skiing or ice skating, she stayed in and prayed for their safety, wishing the experience she had had on no one. But she still was not a creature of warmth. She did not seek out the hot summer sun. If the ice child within her had been stilled, it didn't mean that a new child waited there to take its place. It meant that she was afraid of being who she really was, and so she spent the rest of her childhood and adolescence alone. Often her sleep was plagued by dreams of those hours of cold and exhaustion on her grandfather's farm. The dreams were always the same. She retraced her steps, lay down on the hillside, felt the sting of wind-driven snow against her cheek, saw the gray mouth of the barn open to her left, where the animals were, and warmth and safety. But her joints were frozen shut, and even her lips would not move. She breathed hard through her nostrils, and in her dreams she saw them flaring. It was like a dream of death. At 22, she sought to defeat it. She went out to live in the house she was in now. She did not move out of it, ever. She married, had children, saw her husband die in his 51st year. She grew to again cherish the extremes of the Adirondacks, especially its winters. She decided that they were for toughening her for a very long life. In her imaginings, she saw herself cross-country skiing or building snowmen well past her 100th birthday, greeting visitors, and there would be many, all of them to gaze in awe at the creature who could live so very long, with the broad, toothy, "boy, I showed them" smile of healthy as can be considering my age, 100-year-olds. If a woman could survive 30 below zero nights alone, then she could survive anything. But she was not always alone. Men were attracted to her for various reasons: her independence, her tough attractiveness, her probing intelligence, her wit. And after her husband died, while she was in her mid-40s, there was a parade of men to her door. She made lovers of a few of them, friends of a few others, and turned most away with a polite smile and an explanation that she was seeing no one this year. But men rarely came to see her any more. She had outlived most of her lovers, and those she hadn't had moved away with families or younger women. Her friends mostly stayed at home. Once a week, sometimes only once a month, she was visited by a man named Leo Hines. He lived in Eagle Bay, 20 miles from her home. He was 75 years old, fat, and losing his mind. For a long time she had stopped looking forward to his visits because she could see his pain, the torment he suffered at his own slow decay, and holding conversations with him was like holding a conversation with a talking doll. His storehouse of topics was limited to his children, 2 daughters and a son, all of whom lived in Syracuse, New York, and who came to visit him on Christmas and on his birthday in June. His work as a dentist, from which he'd retired 15 years earlier, and memories of the time he and Muriel had been lovers. It was when he got on that topic that Muriel became very uncomfortable, because he invariably toddled into her bedroom and started to strip. "Let's do it, Muriel," he wheezed at her. "Come on now, let's do it." His voice high-pitched from too many chins and dry from too little saliva. Eventually, he'd realize that lovemaking was impossible for him, and he'd mumble an apology. "Sorry, Muriel, I'm losing my mind." He'd gather up his clothes and sit on the edge of the bed, red-eyed, close to weeping, until she could coax him back into his clothes. He had not visited her for 3 weeks now, and she was beginning to wonder if he had died. She thought that it would be for the best if he had. She sipped her coffee, set the cup gently down on the table near her chair, and she sighed. "Bill," she whispered. "Oh, Bill." Bill was not her husband. His name had been Earl. She was, in fact, not at all sure who Bill was exactly. Lynette Meyer said to Harry Stans, seated across from her at her white enamel kitchen table, "What happened to Myrna?" Harry sipped at the strong coffee Lynette had made for him. It was very hot, and he set the cup down quickly. "Ain't nothing happened to Myrna," he said. "She's still around." "Then what are you doing here?" She lifted her own cup of coffee to her lips and hesitated with her eyes on Harry. He explained with a slight, apologetic grin, "You know I always liked you, Lynette." He was very tall and very thin, and his face was hollow-cheeked, but he had a ruddy complexion and a playful glint in his eye. "I ain't never stopped liking you." "She throwed you out, did she?" Lynette asked and sipped her coffee. "I wasn't living with her, Lynette." Harry picked up his coffee cup. He liked hiding behind it. That was, he supposed, just what Lynette was doing with hers. "How's your child?" Lynette nodded a little. "Jolene is going to be fits as a fiddle in the spring, and she'll be coming back to me. But that ain't what we was talking about, was it, Harry?" "No," Harry admitted. "We was talking about us, I know." Lynette shook her head. The coffee cup couldn't hide her wide grin. "We was talking about you and Myrna. There ain't no us, far as I can see." "Not for lack of wanting," said Harry. Lynette looked out the kitchen window. She could see much of 7th Lake from it. Dog Island was at the center of her field of view, and there were a number of boats around it. She had first seen them there an hour before, at a little past sunrise. She looked at Harry again. "You're giving me nothing but crap, Harry. Like the time you read that awful poetry to me out on the lake. All you wants to do is get me into bed 'cause Myrna's cut you off. Ain't that so?" Harry shook his head meaningfully. "Myrna and me never done it, and that's the truth, Lynette. We never done it. She couldn't, you know, on account of she's got female problems." "Uh-huh," Lynette said, unconvinced. "The only female problems that woman ever had was you, Harry." She chuckled at her joke. Harry chuckled too, though clearly to be polite. "I ain't a bad guy, Lynette." She shook her head again. "Never said you was, Harry." She looked out the window. "Those boats been out there all morning, Harry, and there's a police boat there too." Harry looked and nodded. "Yeah," he said, "someone's missing, you know. Man by the name of John Kennedy, like the president. Ain't that something?" Lynette grimaced. "That damn lake sucks people up like a damn animal, Harry." Harry sighed. He sipped his coffee, found it was comfortably hot now, and took another sip. He set the cup down. "People are right stupid, most of 'em, Lynette." He realized his mistake at once when she gave him a hard look. "'Cept Pete, of course, who had a bad accident that couldn't be helped." Her hard look softened. "No, Harry, Pete was 'bout as stupid as a dinner napkin, I'd say, and couldn't swim besides." Harry looked surprised. "Sure Pete could swim. He told me he could swim." "Then he lied. Wouldn't have been the first time, Harry. He lied like a used car salesman, and he lied a lot. He couldn't swim. He didn't have no coordination. He couldn't put one arm out in front of the other, you know, like a person has to do in order to swim. He couldn't get it right. I think he could dog paddle, after a fashion, and that was all he could do. He didn't tell no one because he was ashamed. So I figure when he fell into that lake with all his winter clothes on, that he sank like a stone." Harry drank the last of his coffee, then looked longingly at the pot on the stove. "Got more of this, Lynette? I could use a whole gallon of it." She nodded. "Sure, Harry. You want some muffins, too? I got some muffins from last night that Pete Jr. didn't eat. They're blueberry." Harry looked pleased. "I'd like that, sure." He looked out the window. "Those boats are going away now, Lynette. I'll find out if they located the guy, and I'll let you know later tonight. I'll come over, and I'll let you know." He looked hopefully at her. She grinned at him. You're 'bout's persistent as a summer cold, Harry." Her grin changed. "You come over when Pete Jr.'s in bed and we'll discuss it." His face lit up. "About 7:30, Lynette?" She stood, took his coffee cup from him, gave him a stern look. "Harry, we'll discuss it, okay? Just don't bring none of your damn poetry." "I'll leave it home, Lynette. For sure, I'll leave it home." Chapter 7, January 15th. Linda Kennedy was a short, thin, red-haired woman with deep-set green eyes, a bulbous nose that she had complained about all her life. Can you imagine God giving someone a nose like this? He must have gotten out of the wrong side of the bed that morning. And a mouth whose upper lip was all but missing, which gave her a humorless, rigid look, though she was neither humorless nor rigid. She did not share her husband's love for islands. She did not like them, especially if they were small, as Dog Island was, because she imagined that they were going to sink and the water rush over her. For the same reason, she did not like to swim. At the moment, as she stood on a hog-sized hump of bare earth in a clearing at the center of Dog Island, under a frigid, bright blue January sky, dressed in a pair of jeans, a red shirt, and brown leather jacket, she was feeling playful. She had no idea why. Even before John's disappearance, the whole aura of the trip to Seventh Lake had been gloomy. He had asked her here so he could tell her he wanted out of the marriage. It was okay. She'd been expecting it for a long time. She had seen the signs: disinterest in bed, disinterest at the breakfast table, disinterest on a night out, disinterest in what she had to say, disinterest in what he had to say. Their lives together had become a monument to boredom, but it had been a cutting blow to ask her to the place of their honeymoon simply so he could beg out of the marriage. Not that that was unlike him. He got perverse delight, she thought, from such things. He had once taken a girlfriend, she knew that there had been more than a few, to a restaurant that he and Linda talked of as their restaurant, and had even contrived to be seated at their table. Years later, when he had felt in a confessional mood and had wanted to get his meandering off his chest, he had explained that he hadn't realized it was their restaurant and their table until the meal was half done. And what could he do then? She thought now, on Dog Island, on that hog-sized hump of earth, under a frigid blue January sky, that she was feeling playful because she was glad John Warner Kennedy was out of her life forever. And if he had drowned, that was too bad. It had probably been an awfully uncomfortable and distracting way to die. But he was dead, and that was that, and so she could feel playful. She called to her husband, "Oh, John, are you there?" The stand of pines around her absorbed her words, and so did 2 or 3 inches of wet snow layered on the bare earth. She repeated herself, "Oh, John, are you here?" louder, and with her hands cupped at her mouth, and felt a little disquieted at first that the island soaked her words up as if she were yelling into cotton. "John, damn you, are you here?" she yelled. It wasn't good enough, she thought. The simple fact that John was gone wasn't at all good enough to satisfy her. He might come back, might surprise her, might pop out from behind a door one day. He liked that sort of thing, too, popping out from behind doors and furniture to scare her, and telling her a small lie in his persuasive way, simply to see how far she'd go along with it. "Oh, my God, someone got run over. I don't believe this, Linda, but some poor slob got run over right in front of the house." "Oh, my God, you're kidding." A smile, a wink. "Well, of course I'm kidding. Funny, though, huh?" His sense of humor, she thought now, had been the same sort of humor that a cat probably feels when it's tossing a mouse high into the air. This was not enough. He simply wasn't here, on this island, alive or dead. It was simply not like him. It would not have happened to him. It could not have happened to him. John, you asshole! Where in the hell are you? The snow and the pines soaked her words up. She barely heard them. She tried to out-yell herself. John, answer me, you idiot! Answer me! Answer me! Answer me! And the island soaked her words up. It did not seem right under that bright and frigid blue sky to have her words soaked up that way. It seemed unnatural, even a little perverse. And that was it. The island itself was perverse. The island was reaching out and snatching her words into itself, snatching them out of her mouth, reaching into her throat and squeezing her larynx. She took a breath. She recognized the signs, could see the fear starting. It had been stupid to come out here in the first place. She got down off the hog-sized hump of earth and started through the shallow, melting snow, past her own footprints. The brown of the earth showed in them, toward a path through the encircling pines 50 feet away. She stopped. She heard someone calling to her. She looked back. She saw the hump of earth. She saw a man standing just inside the perimeter of the pines beyond. She looked at him a moment. No, she decided. It wasn't a man. It couldn't be. It was an opening in the pines that was shaped like a man. She looked away, and again she heard her voice being called. She looked back. Linda? She heard from nearby, and because she saw nothing, she thought once more that the island was reaching out to her, that it was calling to her, and she found comfort in that fantasy, because it was a fantasy. What else could it be? Like the island sinking and the water rushing over her were fantasies. They were both so much easier to deal with than the voice she had heard. She shook her head. She should not have come here. Linda? She heard again. She walked backward, away from the voice. She didn't remember seeing the 2-story white clapboard house when she had come to the island, so she decided that she had come from the wrong direction, which satisfied her to the extent that it allowed her to approach the house cautiously, down the same muddy slope from which her husband had approached it almost a week earlier. She saw what he had seen, too. The back wall of the house bore 2 windows, one beneath the peak of the roof and one to the left on the first floor. Both windows were bare of curtains. The bottom half of the attic window stood open. On the ground at the center of the back wall there was a large black tank for propane. The tank bore a patina of rust along its top edge. The rust ran in rivulets down the sides through the black paint from beneath a thick, moist layer of pine needles. One of 4 thin green metal legs that held the tank up had rusted away completely. Linda supposed, upon seeing this, that the leg had rusted because it was closest to the water and that the tides brought the water level up close to the bottom of the tank. The house stood on short, thick, rectangular stilts. Linda could see only 2 of these stilts from where she stood. She thought fleetingly as she looked at them that the years had taken their toll and that before long the stilts would crumble and pitch the house into the lake. It surprised her when she went up to the back door of the house and knocked. She expected no answer. The house had the crumbling look of abandonment about it. But then she felt movement through the soles of her shoes on the narrow gray wood porch, and she supposed that someone was getting up and coming to the door. She smiled, though it was a chore. She had no idea what she was going to say to whoever answered her knock. She waited. She knocked again felt movement through the soles of her shoes. The back door had a window in it. There were drawn curtains on the window, but there was a half-inch opening at the center. Linda leaned over a little and peeked through this opening. She saw the side of a refrigerator within a 6 feet of the door. It was smudged, and its color was that of dirty cream, clearly, Linda thought, from decades of use. And there was what looked at first like a diagonal ripple in its metal skin, as if someone had dented it. Above the refrigerator, she could see a horizontal sliver of light, and she guessed that this was the top of a window at the front of the house. She straightened. She knocked again. She leaned over and peered once more through the opening between the curtains. She saw now that what she had thought at first was a dent in the cream-colored skin of the refrigerator was really a motionless bare arm, that someone had been standing at the door all this time. She backed down the steps. I'm sorry," she whispered. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean to. I didn't mean anything." Then she turned and clambered up the muddy slope. Fear gripped her all the while, and confusion, too, as if she had been glimpsing a nightmare in its benign early stages. Chapter 8. History, August 29th, 1976. The mailman's name was Lucius Kellogg, and he'd been delivering mail to people around 7th Lake for a dozen years. Ben Mosiman had realized on the very first day's delivery that the man liked to chat. Kellogg had docked his 12-foot mail boat, reached up, and handed him a handful of birthday cards. It was Ben's 42nd birthday, and had asked, smiling, "I'd say you're from Ohio, am I right?" Ben had started to answer, and Kellogg had cut in, nodding. "I'd say Ohio, and I'm not never wrong. Well, hardly ever. You know, son," Kellogg was in his mid-60s, "I thought I was wrong once, but I was mistaken." He'd laughed. "Say, you ain't got some coffee, have you?" "Sure," Ben said. "I like my coffee like I like my women, Ben. Hot, sweet, and black." Another laugh. "Not really, Ben. I never had no black woman, but I heard it don't rub off, so I don't think I'd mind giving it a try." Today, almost 2 months later, Kellogg's patter was the same. Lots of bad jokes and ethnic references, and Ben was aching to see him go. Kellogg said, "You heard about those damn tall ships coming into New York Harbor for the damn bicentennial thing, right?" Ben nodded. "Bet you didn't hear that the Polish tall ship was a damn 5 hours late, huh?" Ben shook his head and answered, trying to sound half surly, "No, I hadn't heard that, Mr. Kellogg. Is there some significance to it?" Kellogg shook his head. "Ain't no significance to nothing, I guess." It was clearly something he found uproariously funny, because he broke into a long fit of howling laughter. When he was done, Ben said, "I'm sorry, Mr. Kellogg, but I've got some repairs to make on the house." Kellogg interrupted. "You hadn't ought to live here, you know." It was something that Ben had heard before. "Yes, Mr. Kellogg, so you've told me, ad nauseum." "I mean it. It ain't safe, you know. It's gonna go—" "As I said, Mr. Kellogg, I've heard it before. I'm in the process, or at least I intend to be in the process, of making it safe, if you'll let me have the time." Kellogg shrugged, nonplussed by Ben's outburst. "Don't matter nothin' to me, Ben, but you got a couple cute kids and a cuter wife, and you know no one in Eagle Bay can figure out what in the Sam Hill you're doing out here." "Trying to mind my own business, Mr. Kellogg," Ben cut in. "What we're doing out here is trying to mind our own damned business." January 16th. Arnaud had had 3 minor traffic accidents in 15 years. He drove badly because his mind wandered, But when he tried to force himself to concentrate on what was going on around him, he found that his speed dropped to below 20. His eyes focused on the area directly in front of the hood, and a dozen cars, horns honking, were soon backed up behind him, unable to pass on the narrow, twisting Adirondack roads. Today he was driving to the little settlement of cottages where Lynette Meyer and Harry Stans lived. He was going to visit Tom Lord, a woodworker who made ornamental pine furniture, which Arnaud offered for sale at the inn. Arnaud sang as he drove. He sang loudly and well, his voice a rich, low tenor. Today he was singing, "The water is wide." He sang, "The water is wide, I cannot get over, and neither have I wings to fly. Give me a boat that can carry two, and both shall row, my love and I." He rounded a wide, slow turn, began the verse again. "The water is wide, I cannot get over, and neither have I wings to fly. Give me a boat," and mashed his foot into the brake pedal. The car's rear end spun around on the road, wet from a snowfall the previous evening. A pickup truck appeared around the curve, swerved left, and missed him by inches. Arnaud spun the steering wheel desperately. The car straightened, then fishtailed in the opposite direction. He felt a deadening thump from the right fender. The car stopped. Arnaud's upper body shot forward. His lap belt stopped him. He looked toward the shoulder of the road. A young deer lay there, head lifted, eyes glazed in shock and pain, its lower body twitching. Arnaud slid across the front seat, opened his door, and got out. He heard from behind him, "Gonna take it?" He turned his head. A thin man of about 40, with long, stringy black hair and several days' growth of beard, stood next to the pickup. The man nodded grinningly at the struggling deer. "Gonna take it?" he repeated. "'Cause if you ain't, I will." Arnaud understood at once. He shook his head. "The animal is not yet dead, sir," he said. "The animal is suffering." "Yeah," the man said, and stopped grinning. "I guess he is now, but judging by the way you hit him, he won't be for long." Arnaud understood this, too. He said reluctantly, "Do you have a gun?" The man shook his head. "Yeah," he said, "but I ain't got no shells for it." Arnaud looked at the deer. It still had its head raised. Its rear end still was twitching. Arnaud said, as much to himself as to the man behind him, "The animal is suffering." "Maybe you ought to get your car out of the way, mister," the pickup truck driver suggested. Arnaud ignored him. He was intent on the deer. He moved forward, so he was standing over it. It was very young, he realized, probably less than a year old. Arnaud shook his head. "Forgive me," he said. The pickup driver said, "Car's gonna come around that bend, and there's gonna be hell to pay." Arnaud took several steps to his left, leaned over, picked up a rock the size of a muskmelon, brought it back to where the deer lay. "Forgive me," he said again, and brought the rock down very hard into the center of the animal's forehead. The pickup truck driver said, "It's for sure not suffering no more. I'll take it now, 'kay?" Arnaud threw the rock down. "Yes," he said. The pickup truck driver came around Arnaud's car, lifted the young deer by placing one arm under its belly and the other under its chest, carried it to the pickup, and threw it into the bed of his truck. "Thanks a lot, mister," the driver called. "This'll keep me and the missus in meat for a long time. Best move your car." Arnaud nodded dully, whispered, "Yes," got into his car by the passenger door, and slid across the seat. He put the car in gear. He hesitated. He was reminded of his first encounter with the people who lived here year-round. It had been 15 years earlier. He had gone into Eagle Bay for groceries and had walked into the firehouse looking for directions. He had seen two men seated in big, dilapidated, overstuffed chairs. They were looking at a Montgomery Ward catalog. He nodded. One of the men, the closest to him, had growled, "Go ahead, say it, mister." Arnaud shook his head. "Hello?" he guessed. The man held the catalog up so its cover was to Arnaud. "No, this. "This catalog?" said Arnaud. "A Monkey Ward catalog. Go ahead, get it off your chest." Again Arnaud shook his head. "This conversation is at right angles to my comprehension." "Huh?" said the man who had remained silent. "He's trying to say he doesn't know what the hell we're talking about, Jim," said the man holding the catalog. "And I sure as hell wish he'd get it off his chest. Go ahead, say it. Say Monkey Ward catalog." "But why would I say that?" "Because," said the first man, "everyone does. They say Monkey Ward for Montgomery Ward because they think that's what we say. But we don't. We say Monkey Ward. Okay?" "Okay," said Arnaud, shrugging. "Okay," said the second man. Now, 15 years later, as he watched the taillights of the pickup truck recede, the memory made him smile. History, September 2nd, 1976. Joe Archer had his hand on the doorknob of his bedroom door, and he was cursing repeatedly under his breath when his son-in-law, Ben, came in from an inspection of the underside of the house and, grinning, put a hand on the old man's shoulder. Joe Archer turned his head and gave him a stunned look. Ben said, his lips forming his words in an exaggerated way, "Is your door stuck again, Joe?" Joe nodded dismally, gave the door a feeble tug, then looked pleadingly this time at Ben. Ben said, "It's the damned moisture, you know." Joe nodded. "I know that," he whispered. "I'm not stupid." Ben said, "I realize you're not stupid, Joe." He reached around his father-in-law to open the door. Joe let go of the knob. Ben took it, turned it, gave it a mighty tug. The door opened. Joe looked embarrassed. He studied his small, neat bedroom. It was at the south side of the house, behind the kitchen, and the view out its one window was of a short, muddy slope and a cluster of young pine trees beyond. He shook his head. Ben had no idea why, and said, looking at Ben, "What'd you find down there?" He nodded to indicate the underside of the house. Ben sighed. "We have several problems, Joe. The biggest problem is that one of the stilts is cracked. Not completely. I think it will hold until we can make repairs. I'm going into Eagle Bay today for lumber, and I'm not sure, but I believe that the refrigerator's on the fritz." Because the house had been built several years before electricity had been brought to the island, the refrigerator, which the Mosimans had bought with the house, was propane-powered. Our ice cream melted and the fish spoiled, I'm afraid. "Fish spoiled?" said Joe Archer. "I can check that, Ben. I know about those refrigerators. I can check it. Might be leaking. We ought to throw it out, I'd say. Get a new one." Ben shook his head briskly. "No thanks anyway, Joe, but I'd rather have someone from Eagle Bay look at it. I realize you've worked with propane refrigerators, but you don't have the proper tools, do you? And without them—" Joe Archer cut in, shaking his head. "I don't understand you, boy. I never did." And with that, he went into his bedroom and closed the door. Ben sighed, went to the kitchen door, which opened onto the house's small boat dock, opened it, saw the mail boat coming. He waited. Kellogg pulled his boat up behind Ben's at the dock, climbed out, and brought Ben the day's mail. Evening. Arnaud Burge could see Dog Island through the north-facing window in his office on the inn's second floor. He looked at it now and, because it was well after dusk, saw only a dark lump on the smooth gray surface of the lake. He used the island as a point of focus when he was lost in thought or when he simply wanted to drift. It's what he wanted to do now. He wanted to enjoy this place and this time and this solitude. He so rarely had the opportunity for it. The inn was like a small child in need of nearly constant care, even when it was all but empty, and he usually found himself bustling from one task to another, then to yet another. Now he had some time to himself, and he wanted to do absolutely nothing with it. His mind wouldn't let him accomplish that, however. It was used to continuous exercise, and now, with his gaze on the island, he found that the island shimmered and was lost if he looked directly at it, so he had to shift his gaze slightly to the right or left to keep it in view. His thoughts ricocheted from here to there, from Mary, his daughter, to his new charges at the hotel, to beach erosion, a problem in recent years because the lake's level was rising inexplicably, to the obscenity with the deer that day, to his continuous struggle with the language. He often tested phrases mentally again and again, revising them until he hoped they were right, to his own aloneness or loneliness. He wasn't sure which word fit. The meaning of both words blended in his head, and he supposed, after all, that his own phrase, ache for another person, fit best. He had had that ache from the instant of Martha's death, and for years he had flogged himself with the fact of it. He had asked himself many times, "That's all she was for you, Arnaud? Only a body nearby, and a face and a brain, someone to let her cold toes slip over you and warm up themselves in the winter nights?" And every time he'd asked the question, his immediate answer had been yes, because it summed up what she was, another human being to share space on the planet with him. She'd done that, and she'd done it well. Now, except in his memory, which was wonderfully and colorfully selective, and showed him only the best of her and the best of their times together, she was gone. He thought from time to time about Jean Ward. He had noted that he'd mentioned her in one of his letters to Mary, and he had seen her walking about as if merely drifting, as he was trying to do now. Ageless was the word he had been groping for in his letter to Mary when he'd written, "She is the sort of person for which the years sit on neither this way nor that, and it is becoming increasingly so with the days passing." Ageless. And that was becoming truer as time passed. But Arnaud didn't know what that meant, or if it was important to his feelings about her, though he didn't know precisely what those were either. He found her good to look at. Graceful on the eyes was the phrase he had used in a letter to his daughter. He liked her walk, her manner of speaking and conversation, which he called "for both of us, not for one only." And he had looked at her and wondered about going to bed with her. He had not wondered what sort of performance she might give. He had wondered how she would hold him, and how he would hold her, how natural and spontaneous and long-lived it would be. An hour earlier she had come to dinner in the main dining room. Dinners were served inside, on the second floor, in the very large room on the inn's south side. In summer they were served on a small terrace, protected by a wrought iron gate. The terrace overlooked the beach and boat docks. He'd come out of the kitchen and had the taste of the evening's meal, trout almondine, in his mouth when she called to him from across the room. He went over to her table. She said, smiling up at him, "The hospital says my brother is improving." Arnaud said, with, he realized, the wrong tone, I'm happy. Because she came back, "Oh, about anything in particular?" And her smile became quizzical. He decided to improvise. "About living," he said, and smiled back. "And about your brother, too." She was clearly embarrassed. "I'm sorry, I didn't understand you." "I think that no one always does. I write down sentences I have used in the days which are good." He stopped. Her quizzical smile had become one of confusion. He went on. "See now, even that one there is not too useful and has gotten you in the mud." "In the mud? Mire?" "Oh, I understand now. Good, I'm happy." She nodded. "So am I. Very. I love your inn, Arnaud." He had liked the way she said that. Now, with his eyes on Dog Island, he remembered it and smiled. The solitude, he realized, was for moments like this. A knock came at his door. A voice called, "Mr. Burge?" "Yes, come in," Arnaud answered. There was the sound of someone trying the door. Then, "I can't. It's locked." Arnaud stood, sighing, crossed the room, opened the door. Jeff Glynn was at it with a bemused expression on his face. He gestured to his right and explained, I'm sorry, but there's a man." He stopped, let his mouth fall open slightly as if he were going to continue, closed it, gestured again, went on. "Downstairs, near the game room, outside the game room, Mr. Burge, there's a man, outside the game room, near the door to the game room, and he's standing very quietly." He shook his head as if in confusion. Arnaud said, "What man?" Glynn cocked his head. "What man? I don't know. I haven't seen him before. Just a man, an older man, and he's very still. I thought he might be suffering, having an attack of some kind, a heart attack maybe, and I thought I'd better come up here and let you know." Arnaud nodded briskly. "Thank you. I will come after you." "Huh?" said Glynn. Arnaud gestured toward the stairway to the first floor. The game room wasn't far from where it terminated. "I will come after you, and together we will go and accost this quiet man." Glynn said, "Oh, yeah, I see. Thank you. So," he moved his head to the right, "I'll go down there right now and I'll show you?" "That would be good," said Arnaud. "Right," said Glynn, and he turned and went to the stairway with Arnaud behind him. Glenn opened the door to the game room and called to his wife, Amy, who was playing table tennis with Muriel Fox. She was delighted that the inn was open so late in the year. During summers, she ate here often. "Amy, where'd that guy go, that guy who was out here? You saw him, right?" Amy made a quick, masterful shot that got past Muriel Fox, who ran after the ball, cursing under her breath. Amy called, "See who?" "The guy who was out here, that old man." "I didn't see him go anywhere." She paused. Who are you talking about?" Jeff shook his head. "That old man who was standing outside this door a few minutes ago." "Old man?" Muriel had retrieved the ping-pong ball and was standing expectantly with it at her end of the table. "Someone went through there," he called and nodded to indicate a set of closed glass and dark wood doors at the far end of the huge room. "Just a couple of minutes ago. I saw him when I came back from the John." Amy gave him a confused look. "I didn't see anyone." "That's because you were too busy totaling up your score, dear," Muriel said. Arnaud said, "Was he a guest?" Muriel shrugged. "Who knows?" "And he went through those doors?" "Sure, I guess so. I didn't see him go through, but he's not here now, so ipso facto." "I'm sorry," said Arnaud. Muriel gave him a grin. "Since," she explained, "he is not here now, and since he was heading in that direction, and since he has not come back through here," she nodded to indicate their half of the room, "then ipso facto, he must have gone through there. She nodded to indicate the doors at the far end of the room. Who are you talking about? Said Amy Glenn. The older gentleman, her husband explained. He stepped into the game room. Arnaud followed. The big oak door closed slowly behind them. Amy Glenn shrugged. I'm sorry, I must have missed him. There was a man here? Jeff Glenn sighed. Yes, as we've been discussing for the past 5 minutes, Amy. She gave him a flat smile. It looked playfully menacing on her pixie-ish face. Don't do that, Jeff. Do what? What you doing? And I say, said Muriel Fox, that we get on with this game. Just what is it that I'm doing, Amy? You're talking to me as if I'm defective. No one's defective. He was clearly astonished at her outburst. No one's defective, he repeated, and looked back at Arnaud for support. Did I say anyone was defective, Mr. Burge? Did you hear me say, Amy, you're defective? Did I say that? Arnaud answered, It is at right angles to the geography of this discussion that we have in our hands. There were things in the game room which were deaf. There were spiders in several of the high corners, and they could not hear. They could merely sense vibration. The same was true of the flies that happened into the webs that the spiders built. It was true as well of the entity which waited with consummate patience at the glass and dark wood doors. It was waiting for the doors to be opened. It existed in a world of confusion, where switches opened and closed at random, where tears fell into mouths caught in the climax of a laugh, where need was left over from the world that had gone before, but was mixed together with lust and with memory, longing and pain, where pain was mixed with pleasure, and pleasure with guilt, hatred, love, and love with confusion. It could not hear the conversation going on at the opposite end of the game room. It was deaf, and even if it were not, it wouldn't have cared to listen. So, as it had done for a very long time at many doors, it would wait a day, a week, a month. Just as it cared nothing for conversation, it owed nothing to time. And when at last the doors were opened, it would go through, and it would find another door blocking its path, and it would wait. History, September 4th, 1976. See that lizard there? Joe Archer said to his grandson, Max, pointing at what he saw only as a green splotch on the gray surface of the pond at the center of Dog Island. Yeah, I see it, Max said, and searched the ground for a rock to throw at it. Joe went on, You know why he's in that patch of sunlight? He's in that patch of sunlight 'cause he wants to get warm. He's cold-blooded, so he wants to get warm. Nothing in this universe wants to be cold, Max. Max leaned over, picked up a $50-sized flat rock, and winged it at the lizard, missing it by inches. Joe finished. Because being cold, my boy, is like being dead. Thank you for joining us for this week's episode, and I hope you'll join us next week for the next installment of The Island. And until then, have a great week, everyone.
Say goodbye to itching and stinging and swelling with B-Itch Stop, your all-natural solution for fast relief from bug bites and stings and skin irritations of all kinds. It's made right here in Nevada with safe, all-natural ingredients. Our formula is gentle enough for all ages and skin types. Whether it's mosquito bites, bee or wasp stings, spider bites, or even cactus thorns and poison ivy, B-Itch Stop works fast to soothe and calm your skin. Get yours today. And you know you can get it right here on our site at the store. Now you just go ahead and check that out. I swear by it myself. This is Clay Steele. Take care of yourself.